everybody questions. First, I felt it was very important for us to have you, because 2015 was for us the year of sustainability. And because it was the year of sustainability, we wanted absolutely to focus on it, to focus on sustainability, to focus on corporate governance. But if I may ask you, who have very much corporate governance at heart and who have initiated the Pearl Initiative, you have Pearl Initiative, of which the Chalhoub Group is
Absolutely.
member of as well.
Extremely supportive partner.
Thank you. So what led you to initiate this Pearl Initiative, and how does it differentiate itself from other organizations into the same field?
Thank you, Patrick, and really, again, thank you for your hospitality and for having me here. So the Pearl Initiative, I mean, I guess the fundamental concern and maybe frustration was this feeling that there is this over-reliance on government in our region to really try and do something about the challenges that we face. And I was hearing a lot about how people saying that, business standards and governance standards across the region really won't change until we have stringent and tough rules and regulations imposed on us by governments, as they do in the more developed and advanced economies of the world. And that notion that unless we're forced to behave in a manner which is consistent with global standards, that it's going to be a futile exercise. And I just didn't buy that. It's not news that the global financial collapse in 2009 didn't emanate from the Middle East. It emanated from some of the most developed markets in the world, from the most regulated markets in the world, where, in theory, the most advanced regulations and rules are already in place. And to a large extent, that collapse, that tsunami that eventually hit the Middle East, happened because of a collapse in governance in these advanced markets. So I believed fundamentally, and in discussions with peers, such as yourself, when we first established the Pearl Initiative together, was that until we as business leaders truly understand and believe that it's in our enlightened self-interest to embrace these principles of governance and to identify with the true value creation that comes out of embracing this, that everything else is going to be futile. So not relying on or waiting on rules and regulations in order to generate this change and to embrace these values, but doing it because we believe that there is value creation involved in it. And that was really the genesis of the Pearl Initiative, which was to create this culture of good business practice, of corporate of accountability, transparency, because it makes business sense. And in terms of differentiators, it was very important that from day one, that if we were going to be setting out trying to generate this cultural shift, that it had to be done in partnership. And it wasn't just going to be UAE or, even, two countries. It had to be everybody who was actively involved. And that includes not just local businesses, such as the Chalhoub Group or the Crescent Group, but also multinationals that are working here, because there was this perception that there's double standards. Multinationals, they have their own rules in their own country. When they come here, they play on a whole different set of rules. So that was really the two, differentiating factors behind the mission of the initiative.
In any case, it's a great initiative, and thank you to have established it. In your talk, you have spoken a little bit about the power of corporate governance to make a company more resilient. Mm-hmm. So can you give us some examples about how it works in practice? How does it especially work into family businesses like yours, like ours?
Yeah, family businesses, this is, on the one hand, I see them as really the region's greatest opportunity, but also one of the region's greatest risks. And the reason,
especially in this third generation, which is coming.
Well, that's the thing.
It.
So in terms of opportunity, family businesses generate, and these are not my numbers, they're according to the IMF, generate close to 90% of all non-oil GDP across the Middle East and North Africa. They have huge sway, both societally and even politically. And they have, I think, one of the best opportunities to be able to to work to address some of the greatest socio-economic challenges which exist in our region: youth unemployment, the skills gap, promoting entrepreneurship, so on and so forth. And I think they can do this most effectively than any other sector, including the government. But the risk side is that until and unless we really continue to institutionalize and professionalize our structures as family businesses, we can risk huge value destruction. The reality is the vast majority of family businesses here in the Middle East and North Africa are in the second generation. 70% apparently are in the second generation. And there's a $1 trillion of assets that's going to pass between one generation and the next in the Middle East and North Africa over the next 10 years. Now, global statistics will tell you that only 15% of businesses survive, or family businesses survive beyond the third generation. And so if you apply that, back of the envelope calculation, until we develop, or unless we develop those protections in place, we have a potential to lose $850 billion worth of value. I mean, this sounds sensationalist, but I think this is the only way we're going to generate that sort of action. And it's, again, as I said, the numbers globally have demonstrated this. So how do we do this? I mean, we've been doing, again, through the Pearl Initiative, a number of discussions, surveys, and it's all peer-to-peer. For example, less than 50% of the businesses which we've talked to across the region have shareholder agreements between their various shareholders of the family businesses. Very few, less than 10%, have clearly defined dispute resolution mechanisms. And people are people. People will always disagree. That, in fact, can be a strength. But if you don't have certain methodologies in place to address the potential negative aspects of disagreement, then you're risking the whole venture. And at a time when we're supposedly trying to create all these entrepreneurial endeavors and entrepreneurship, and I know that's something you, Patrick, are very passionate about as well, as am I, that's fantastic. And the idea we're doing that is to create stronger SMEs, and SMEs are the biggest employers in any economy. But the reality is entrepreneurship, by definition, is a risky endeavor. A very small percentage, 1 in 10 maybe, are really going to be generating the impact, the big employment that we need. And that doesn't mean we should stop that, but at the same time, we should be protecting the existing institutions. The existing institutions that have the most potential to keep growing and to generating more employment and to expanding. And I don't think enough is being done about identifying where we can improve the health and resilience of these companies and these family businesses.
Unless we create good corporate governance. As
absolutely, including that, indeed.
About it. So, are the principle of corporate sustainability and governance universal? And if so, what can we learn from others, from more mature markets?
Look, I think there are certain principles that are universal, that are ubiquitous wherever you go. But what's very important is not to apply a cookie-cutter approach and say what works in America is going to work here, is going to work in Japan. Every system, every region has its own cultural nuances, it has its own social sensitivities. So you must always find something that's adapted to the region. I mean, you take, for example, corruption, which is one of the tenets of the Pearl Initiative. And what a businessman in New York and a businessman in Dubai view as corruption might not be different. I'm not judging at the moment which one is better. I'm just saying it's different. Forget about East and West, because that's usually the typical comparison. Just take East and East, take West and West, take,
US and Europe.
Yeah, US and Europe. Take London, New York, مثلا. The practices of political campaign contributions in the US, where generating billions, and now we have the elections coming up, and the billions and billions they're going to be generated for presidential candidates just to slag each other off in public, will be considered corruption in the UK general elections. So you have different rules and regulations that govern that. And the same will apply somewhere in the Middle East and North Africa. So I think we need to find, here we're a relationship-based culture, not a rule-based culture. So what that means, and what I've sort of found, is naming and shaming is not the best way to generate action. Naming and faming tends to work a little bit better. Really working through positive reinforcement. Taking, for example, again, using corruption a lot of companies, and I think public companies are now obliged to institute this
Anti-corruption.
whistleblowing, whistleblowing policies, where you're encouraged to report any bad practice of either a subordinate or someone you report to. And so companies are doing that because it's the thing to do. And I've seen a number of companies, including, of course, especially public companies, and they institute these policies, and then a year later they look and they say, wow, there's nobody reported anything, we are 100% clean. Well, the reality is they haven't appreciated that culturally, expecting here, particularly in the region, everybody to go and report on a superior, or even in some cases a subordinate, is not as acceptable as it might be, say, sitting in London or in New York. So people don't report things. But just because they don't report it doesn't mean that it's not going on. So it's a false sense of security. So what we're trying to do with that is say, okay, whistleblowing, that's important and everybody expects it, but why don't we try and put something else in? And we came up with something called a trumpet blowing policy as well, where you're encouraged to report good practices also. If you sit in a meeting and you see that your procurement manager has taken a decision because of an unsavory business practice, go and report that. That positive reinforcement helps really generate that action and that culture. So again, it's really finding something which is fit for purpose.
And you were speaking about the expectation from government to put the rules and regulation, and the fact that private businesses have to take their businesses in hand. But does the government have a role to play into encouraging this corporate governance and sustainable engagement into companies?
Yeah, I normally say government should just keep out, but in this case, no, I think government does, to the extent that, look, business is ultimately, and private sector is ultimately motivated by incentive, right? So, businesses need to identify with the value creation. Now, there are multiple strings that can be pulled. Macro incentives and disincentives. There's legal, there's financial, there's ethical, and if you look at the strings which government can pull, as I say, you have the financial ones, which can be in the form of subsidies, which I'm not a fan of, or financial incentives to say if you adopt a certain practice, then you will get a certain benefit of sorts. It doesn't have to be in the form of cash incentives as subsidies. There's legal, which is regulatory. You have to do something, and therefore everybody has to come in line. There's the PR strings, which can be pulled, which, we will make you more famous as a company. We will stand behind you. And that works very well here in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf. The patronage of our leadership here is very important to businesses. So if a member of the royal family stands alongside you when you're announcing something, that is important. And so that's an incentive. There's also functional incentives. I mean, in many cases, if you look at, say, environment and sustainability, things sometimes work better and are better for the environment, and that's an incentive. LED bulbs aren't just friendlier to the environment, they also happen to be cheaper, that's the financial, but actually they last longer,
sure.
And that's the functional. Cars, I drove a Tesla a few days ago, and sure, it's much better for the environment, but I also found it a lot more
no noise.
yeah, comfortable, a lot more functional. The technology was all there. Again, on the cost side and the functionality side, it's apparently much easier to maintain. So these are multiple strings that can be pulled, and I think the government does have a role to play in trying to pull some of these strings. And to be honest, if you look at the Middle East and North Africa, governments are, in some cases, they own some of the biggest companies. And so governments need to also lead by example. Otherwise there'll be a sense that there's hypocrisy. So governments can institute some of these practices in their own companies and in their own departments, which employ many people, and by that set examples for private companies. So there is a role in this case for government to play.
Can I ask if someone from the audience would like to ask any question to Badr about the Pearl Initiative, about corporate governance and sustainable engagement?
Just don't ask me what perfume I'm wearing, because I'm not sure.
What mix of perfumes, huh? Any question? Any courageous question? Thank you, Badr. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great speech. Thanks.
Thank you.